half the sustainable development goals that the UN has put in place and which we have ratified as a country, they are about the social dimensions of sustainability. Okay, and the building industry gives a lot of jobs, except they are very poorly paid and, as I said, degrading. But and also our modern building as usual, has destroyed traditional knowledge about which, ironically, was about building sustainably, because out of compulsion. It wasn't as if they were more virtuous. Building as usual is hugely unsustainable, and in three broad domains. One is sustainable, its environmental impact, its impact on resources, and its impact on society. So there are at least 9 ways we have discovered in which we can kill the planet. If you think the planet is a kind of matrix for all kinds of biological life, including human life, and that they are all linked to each other, then this is the famous 9 planetary boundaries framework, which and remember, these are boundaries that are like the 1.5 or 2 degrees temperature rise boundary of climate change. So these are quantifiable or hopefully quantifiable boundaries that scientists have come up with on 9 different fronts, with climate change only one of them. And you can see whenever you see the dark orange bit on the left image, that's where we have gone beyond the zone of uncertainty, which means we are pretty sure that it's now beyond repair almost, or it's in grave danger. And building, so remember that every building is at the environment level is causing damage across all boundaries, and is pushing us closer to those boundaries, not just climate change. And so therefore net zero, net zero is fine. Even if you did a really net zero building, you're only cutting back on one aspect, so don't feel too great about it. And buildings today are the emissions, they're close to 35 to 38% of the emissions, right, that they're contributing. So it's a very, very important domain in which to intervene, both at a national level, as well as an international level. We are also buildings also consume non-renewable resources. So that could be fossil fuels. They consume or they degrade. They could be fossil fuels, they could be minerals. Every time you're building, you have changed the flooring in your house, or you have built a new, used a rare material to refloor your house. Irredeemably, you have extracted something which is not going to be available to anyone else in your generation, and also no one else in the future. And of course, how do we justify it? We'll say, okay, we'll find new ways of doing it. But hello, we are likely to actually eat through the entire set of resources, like we're discovering. We are doing that we've successfully almost done that with fossil fuels, and also with drinking water. Very important. We are losing. We are eating into our. We are damaging our rivers. We are damaging even, of course, marine. That resource within a marine life, because we are damaging seas through pollution. We can't get clean fish anymore. I hesitate. I worry about eating fish in Mumbai, for instance, because of the high mercury content. So there are many resources that we are directly, and then with a spillover effect, we are or a domino effect, we are depleting. And just as an indication of how fossil fuels we will be kind of consuming through building, just look at this graph, and you can see that there are materials which have a higher embodied energy, which means that they they have consumed more of energy in their construction, in their production, and being brought to the site before we have actually built, okay, than some others. So for instance, the more natural materials like timber, etc., are in between. And remember that these are none of these numbers that I will give you are the last word. They just are things to consider where we are in a position to, and then we will have to look at different databases, different researches. We are still fairly early in this stage of being able to especially talk of embodied energy. So there are some materials which consume much more energy in their construction, and some which consume much less. But also remember that before we jump to being very happy that say concrete is lower embodied energy in this graph than say brick, and which is generally the case in many such measurements, there are 8 other or maybe all 9 other boundaries that concrete or cement may be pushing us much closer towards. So we need to be very, very careful in how we make our judgments. We don't yet have the science to be able to make those judgments in a final way. And this is very important. That's an important reason to focus on how people practice. And then finally, there's a social dimension. Remember that half the sustainable development goals that the UN has put in place and which we have ratified as a country, they are about the social dimensions of sustainability. Okay, and the building industry gives a lot of jobs, except they are very poorly paid and, as I said, degrading. And also our modern building as usual, has destroyed traditional knowledge about which, ironically, was about building sustainably, because out of compulsion. It wasn't as if they were more virtuous. And also the skills are lost, and in fact entire economies of labor intensive construction and skill economies have been decimated and are continually undergoing such decimation. And there is, of course, displacement by infrastructure and building projects of all kinds, okay? And also by mining of building materials. In addition, there are public health impacts. So there are a range of impacts. These are just a few that I mentioned. So in this context, it becomes important to decide how do we think of building, how do we think about this task of building sustainability. Now here, I have proposed that we should focus on the idea of a critical practice. And a critical practice is not only of architecture, but it can be of anything. There is a lot of literature on the critical practice of nursing, for instance. So why critique to begin with when we are talking of something creative like architecture? So critique is a springboard first for change and innovation. Only when you are uncomfortable with something, you see some limitations, you want to make a change. And secondly, a sound critique of what is wrong with something provides you a direction for innovation. And what kind of critique? Well, very importantly, to go beyond the boundaries of your own discipline as it has been built. Because remember, the same overall social machine that created the problem has also created certain disciplinary knowledges, whether of architecture, engineering, any economics, anything. So understanding the way the social origins of the environmental crisis, that big picture, you connect to the big picture of the building process itself, and then reconstruct your understanding of your own role. Okay? Which means it involves self-criticism, knowing what we get right and what we get wrong as a profession on an ongoing basis. And should we really be talking of transformation? Isn't that too far-fetched a claim? Well, I think if individuals are practicing, how much change can we make? While I'm very, very wary of romanticizing and creating heroes out of individuals, I think finally all we have is ourselves to begin with. So one person, one project. What else do we have in terms of trying to start making change? And remember that it is very often, why that is useful, why that is important, is because ultimately in change, what matters is the direction. And as you'll see in some of the examples, a new direction of action, which is demonstrated as viable, is once it takes hold, it can really go viral, right? So it's not only how many buildings are built sustainably at this moment that we have to worry about, but what are the ways in which people are building sustainability and why. Right? So a critical practice in this context would question building as usual. It questions the construction industry, the way it is organized, the role of the architect within it, and tries to change that. It seeks to question professional values. What is beautiful, right? Why are big awards going to certain kinds of buildings? It is critical and about client requirements, even client expectations. It gets into dialogue on those. It's also critical about the solutions that are offered, because we saw that industrial capitalism has produced this crisis, and that's also giving us certain kinds of solutions, whether it is green technologies that are then sold at a premium, or rating systems which are useful in some ways, but may also come with assumptions that limit their relevance. So we have to question those in a careful way. And practitioners, as we will see in these examples, have done that, have explored, out of all this, have explored and developed new principles, new ways of working for themselves. And that has involved research, actual experimental research, theoretical research, piloting, developing new technologies, and instituting processes, sometimes creating ecosystems. So all of that is involved in, potentially involved in whatever is in critical practice. There are some broad, across the few examples that we will see, there are some similarities in the as shared principles. Okay, and there are of course new principles and divergences which I won't really have time to get into. But there is a impulse to conserve, whether it is resources, landscapes, cultures, existing processes, to reduce embodied and running energy consumption, not just running energy, not just operational energy, through new sensors, etc., but also embodied energy. Okay? There is a commitment to exploring simpler passive design strategies, which means the way you orient the building. If you orient a long building, if you design a building to be long and keep the length along east-west and shade with a little bit of shading on north and south in much of India, you will actually have reduced the amount of heat that comes into the building to a great extent. Okay? And then you'll therefore reduce the need for, say, even fans and certainly air conditioning. Adaptive comfort means, think about how we live in buildings. When we decide to wear three-piece suits or just suits and blazers, you need 22 degrees centigrade air conditioning, but you are wearing half sleeve thin cotton clothes, even in a corporate office, like very often they are doing in Japan. You can manage at 27 degrees air conditioning, maybe with open windows, which is way more healthy, way healthier. They also these practices focus on local technologies, local knowledges, local skills. And I won't have time to get into it, but this is very important, even knowledge. There'll be one example I will mention in the passing today, where we believe that engineering and architecture have all the answers. Well, they have answers, but they are valid under certain conditions, and they may not be universally available even to all the experts. So it's very important to know what people have actually experienced, and the knowledges of experts are often very broad, at a very higher level of abstraction. They may not tell you much about a particular place. And finally, to try and close various loops, whether water loop or construction material loop, you extract something from the earth, process it, build with it, and then throw it away. So that is a loop that is not closed. But if you build in a way that things can be taken apart and reused, okay, or you reuse old discarded material, then you are closing some of these loops. So these are some common principles, but you will see that the expressions and the context and projects are very, very different.